Thank you to both our guests this morning. Yeah, and I'd like to outline, like Deputy Durkin, I don't have any legal background, so I might just ask a couple of questions in general terms, if you please. I think it's fair to say that the steps that the government has been trying to take over recent months, like all other countries in the world, is to try and obviously fight a pandemic, but I think in Ireland specifically what we were trying to do was avoid the overrun of our hospitals, where we do not have the capacity of countries like the UK or Germany, and therefore it was very important that we try and keep the spread of infection as low as possible. And unfortunately, as Lord Sumption has highlighted, as we're starting to open up, we're seeing what other countries are seeing, which is increased infection, albeit at present it seems to be in lower age groups. Could I just highlight something here? We've had an issue here since the start of lockdown, which was obviously the closure of many sectors of the economy, but specifically what are called wet pubs here, which are pubs which do not serve food, they generally just serve alcohol. And later on during the lockdown, the Health Act was softened to allow what are called gastropubs to open and to serve people food over a period of time, and therefore people could congregate, eat, and we're hoping now for an opening up of the wet pubs in coming months. But I would have spoken on this committee over the previous months about the idea of regionalisation, where let's say Dublin at present has the highest level of COVID infection nearly in the country at the moment, and where I'm from, the constituency that I represent has had one of the lowest, and yet our wet pubs have had to obviously adhere to the national health advice. Do you think that something like that, if you're showing very low concentration of disease and ultimately maybe saying that wet pubs could have opened in my constituency, is that grounds for a judicial review in the future? Or could such a thing be considered in the future if this pattern was to repeat?
Well, I can only answer that question in the light of the public law of the United Kingdom. I believe, though I'm not an expert, that the basic principles are very similar in Ireland. But the only basis on which I think that you could challenge that kind of problem is by saying that it was irrational. My own view is that the government is entitled, as a matter of public law, to a very wide margin of judgment in the area of rationality, and that you would need a very extreme and obvious case indeed for such a challenge to be successful. Having said that, looking at it administratively from the government's point of view, there is obviously a lot to be said for fine-tuning, as far as possible, the regional impact of these measures. And most countries in Europe have done this in one way or another. In the United Kingdom, we now only have lockdowns in specific areas which have been as to high levels of infection. In France, they had a system of green, red and orange areas, which were basically under the control of the departmental prefects, and that seems to work very well. It meant, for instance, that at the height of the pandemic, the scale of restrictions in Paris, where the infection rate was at its highest, was much greater than in the Lozère or the Dordogne, where the figures were much more favourable. That seems to me to be a sensible way of doing it. Ultimately, I think this is a matter of political and administrative judgment. It's not easy to deal with it by law, which is essentially a blunt instrument. Of course, you have to have the power. But ultimately, the decisive factor is going to be the element of clinical, epidemiological and political judgment.
Thank you. Yeah. Could I just speak then to our European representative just on the issue that was... Mr.
Bucicchio.
Yes. Yeah. Mr. Bucicchio, yes. Just on the issue of air travel, which was highlighted about Ireland's dependence on international access. So I know there's probably different protocols, but is there anything within your own office that can ascribe a European protocol for aviation that ultimately that Ireland might have to adhere to? We have the most stringent airline protocols in terms of aviation access in and out of the country, whereas, let's say, Germany and France have far more relaxed rules to that. Is there anything under European, I suppose, guidance that could basically impose a different scenario in Ireland in terms of aviation and air access?
Thank you for these questions, but unfortunately I can't answer to it because it's not in our competencies. But I would like to come back to what you said just before, and I share your worry concerning the difference between parts of the country where the virus is more active and where it's not active at all. And with Jonathan, because we had indeed the case in France, where after the first general lockdown, there were different measures concerning different regions or departments. And until now, for instance, recently, some weeks ago, there was a local lockdown in a part of France. So, but all this must be, you can evaluate all this afterwards. At the beginning, when the first lockdown was, general lockdown was decided, everybody was afraid by this virus, and even also the authorities, of course. Then they decided for a general lockdown, although some regions of the country were completely safe. Now, for instance, they are, after they've learned the lesson, they are differentiating the different departments and impose new restrictions. I'm not talking about lockdown, but wearing the mask or movement around a certain number of kilometers, etc., locally when it's really necessary.